A 10-year-old blind boy whispered 6 words to a Hell's Angel at Seattle's Pike Place Market that made a battle-hardened biker president's hands shake. And what happened next is changing American school culture forever. Before we dive into this story, drop your city in the comments right now, because this story is sweeping across America, and I want to know where our community is watching from. Also, if you believe that showing up for someone who's been abandoned matters more than reputation or fear, hit that subscribe button right now. Now, let's get into it. Pike Place Market smelled like coffee and salt water on Saturday mornings, a mix of roasted beans from the original Starbucks and the Puget Sound breeze that rolled through downtown Seattle carrying the scent of fish and possibility. Sarah Matthews moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, her hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder as they navigated past tourists, snapping photos of flying salmon and street musicians, playing guitars for dollar bills stuffed in open cases. Eric walked beside her with his white cane, tapping a rhythm on the cobblestone, the sound echoing off vendor stalls, selling flowers and honey and apples, so red they looked like they'd been painted. Sarah stopped at her favorite fruit stand, the one run by the old Vietnamese woman who always gave Eric an extra apple because he reminded her of her grandson. And she didn't notice when Eric kept walking, his cane sweeping left and right, but missing the massive man standing directly in his path until it was too late. Eric collided with what felt like a wall made of leather and muscle, and the bag of apples Sarah had just paid for went flying, fruit bouncing across the market floor in every direction. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," Sarah started, rushing forward, but the man was already kneeling, his hands gathering apples with surprising gentleness for someone who looked like he'd been carved from granite and bad decisions. "Hey, little man, you okay?" The voice was deep, gravelly from cigarettes and years of shouting over motorcycle engines. But there was something soft underneath it, something that made Eric stop trembling and tilt his head toward the sound. "Let me help you with these." Eric's hands reached out instinctively, trying to help, and his fingers brushed against leather-thick, worn leather that smelled like motor oil and tobacco, and something else he couldn't quite identify. His small hands explored the texture, finding patches sewn onto the material, raised letters his fingertips couldn't quite read. "Are you a motorcycle man?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the question hanging in the air between them like something fragile and breakable. Mark Wire, Thompson, 48 years old, president of the Hells Angels, Seattle chapter, a man who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and carried scars that weren't all visible, froze with an apple in each hand. "Yeah, buddy, I am." Eric's face scrunched up in concentration, processing this information against everything he'd been taught. "My teacher says motorcycle people are mean, that they hurt people and do bad things." He paused, his head tilting again like a bird listening for danger. "But you don't sound mean." Mark felt something crack open in his chest, some part of himself he'd kept locked down since his brother Danny put a gun in his mouth 15 years ago because he couldn't handle the loneliness anymore, couldn't handle feeling invisible in a world that had forgotten he existed. He looked at this 10-year-old kid with thick dark glasses and a cane, standing in Pike Place Market, judging a Hell's Angel, not by reputation or appearance, but by the only thing he could perceive, the tone of kindness in a stranger's voice. "Your teacher's wrong about some things," Mark said quietly, finishing gathering the apples and standing up, holding the bag out toward Sarah, who was watching this interaction with the wary expression of a mother who'd learned not to trust easily. "What's your name?" "Eric. Eric Matthews." The boy's hands found the bag of apples, his mother guiding them gently. "What's yours?" "Mark Thompson. But my friends call me Wire." He didn't know why he was telling a 10-year-old kid his road name, except that Eric had called him Motorcycle Man, like it was something magical instead of something dangerous, and that felt important somehow. "Why Wire?" Eric asked. "Because 10-year-olds don't understand that some questions are too personal for strangers in farmers' markets." "Because I connect people," Mark answered honestly. "I build bridges between folks who don't trust each other." He hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since Eric touched his vest with such innocent curiosity. "You go to school around here, Eric?" The boy's face changed, the slight smile disappearing like someone had flipped a switch. "Roosevelt Elementary. A few blocks from here. You like it?" The silence stretched too long. Sarah's hand tightened on her son's shoulder, and Mark saw pain flash across her face before she could hide it behind the mask all parents wear when their kids are hurting and they can't fix it. "It's okay," Eric finally said, which is what kids always say when things are very much not okay. "I don't have a lot of friends, but that's fine. I'm used to it." Mark knelt again, bringing himself to Eric's eye level even though the kid couldn't see him, because some things are about respect more than visibility. "How come you don't have a lot of friends? You seem pretty cool to me." Eric's fingers twisted together, a nervous gesture that made him look even smaller than he was. "Kids think I'm weird because I can't see. They don't want to sit with me at lunch or pick me for teams at recess. Sometimes they call me Bat Boy because I use a cane like bats use echolocation." His voice cracked on the nickname, and Mark felt rage rising in his throat, rage at every kid who'd ever made this brave little boy feel like his blindness made him less than human. "How long's that been going on?" Mark asked, keeping his voice steady, even though every instinct screamed to find those kids and teach them what real fear felt like. "Since kindergarten," Eric whispered. "So, a really long time." Mark did the math quickly. 5 years, roughly 180 school days per year. That's 900 days of eating lunch alone, of standing on sidelines, of going home feeling invisible. 900 days of learning that the world sees your disability before your humanity. "I eat lunch alone," Eric continued, the words tumbling out now like he'd been holding them in forever and couldn't stop them anymore. "Every day, I sit at the same table by the windows, and I can hear everyone else laughing and talking, and sometimes I pretend I'm reading a really interesting book so people don't feel bad for me. But really I'm just listening to an audiobook so I don't have to hear how much fun everyone's having without me." Sarah's eyes were wet now, and she looked away, blinking hard, because mothers aren't supposed to cry in public when their sons are being brave enough to tell the truth. Mark's throat felt tight. Words stuck somewhere between his heart and his mouth, because he'd been that kid once, different circumstances. Same loneliness, same feeling of being seen, but not really seen. "Eric," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Okay. Would it help? I mean, would you want?" Mark stopped, started again. "Can you sit with me at lunch on Monday? Just once?" Eric's head snapped up so fast his glasses went crooked, his small face transforming with something that looked dangerously close to hope. "You mean, you'd come to my school? If you want me to." "But—" Eric's voice dropped to a whisper, like he was afraid saying it too loud would make the offer disappear. "Can you sit with me at lunch on Monday? Just once? Nobody ever sits with me." Mark didn't hesitate, didn't think about the logistics or the optics or what the school would say about a Hell's Angel showing up in the cafeteria. "Yeah, Eric, I'll be there." "You promise?" "I promise." Sarah stepped forward then, her voice shaking. "You don't have to do this. I know you're being nice, but—" "Ma'am," Mark interrupted gently, standing to face her, "I meant what I said. Monday, lunchtime. I'll be there." He pulled a business card from his wallet, black leather, embossed with a phone number and nothing else, and pressed it into her hand. "Call me if anything changes. Otherwise, I'll see you both Monday." Eric's smile was so bright it could have powered the entire market, and as Mark walked away, leather vest creaking, boots heavy on cobblestone, he pulled out his phone and texted Kodiak, "Emergency church meeting tomorrow morning. Everyone. No excuses." Because Mark Thompson had just made a promise to a blind 10-year-old who'd been eating lunch alone for 5 years, and he'd learned a long time ago that some promises you don't keep alone, some promises require an army. The Hells Angels Seattle clubhouse sat in South Seattle's industrial district, a brick warehouse that had seen better days, but wore its scars like badges of honor, graffiti-covered and chain-link fenced. American flag hanging above the entrance next to the club's death head logo, both faded from rain and time but still defiant. Mark pulled his bike into the lot at 7 Sunday morning, earlier than he'd called the meeting for, because he needed time to think about what he was going to say. How he was going to explain that a 10-year-old blind kid had just reminded him why they wore these cuts in the first place. The others started arriving at 7:30, rolling in one by one, Kodiak first because he was always first. 6'5" and built like the Alaskan brown bear he'd been nicknamed after. Former Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan before the government decided his PTSD made him unfit for service and sent him home with a handshake and a prescription for pills that didn't work. Then Wrench, the road captain, thin and wiry with hands that could fix any engine ever built and a Navy Cross tucked in a drawer somewhere he never talked about. Stitch showed up third, club medic, former Army combat surgeon who'd saved more lives in Fallujah than he could count, but couldn't save his marriage when he came home different than he'd left. By 8 o'clock, 55 Hells Angels filled the clubhouse men, ranging from 25 to 68 years old, most of them veterans, all of them carrying stories about brothers lost and systems failed and second chances earned on 2 wheels and open roads. They sat on mismatched furniture, donated or salvaged, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, making the kind of jokes men make when they're waiting to find out why their president called an emergency meeting on a Sunday morning. Mark stood at the front of the room, near the banner that read, Seattle Chapter, established 1967, friend forever, forever friend. And he waited until every conversation died down before he spoke. I met a kid yesterday, Pike Place Market. 10 years old, blind since birth, uses a white cane to navigate. His name's Eric Matthews. He paused, letting that information settle. He bumped into me accidentally, we got to talking, and I found out something that's been eating at me for the last 18 hours. The room stayed quiet. These men knew Mark well enough to know when something mattered, and the tone in his voice said, this mattered more than most things. This kid eats lunch alone every single day at Roosevelt Elementary, Mark continued, his voice getting harder with each word. Every single day since kindergarten. That's 5 years. About 900 school days of sitting by himself in a cafeteria full of kids who treat him like he's invisible because he can't see, and they've decided that makes him weird, makes him someone not worth knowing. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every man there. They call him Bat Boy. They trip him in hallways. They steal his lunch. And yesterday, this brave little kid who's been alone for 900 days asked me if I could sit with him at lunch on Monday. Just once. Because nobody ever sits with him. Kodiak stood up slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the couch like something geological shifting. How many days did you say? About 900, give or take. That's unacceptable, Wrench said from the back, his voice flat and cold in the way it got when he was genuinely angry. That's a kid being tortured by isolation while adults watch and do nothing. His teacher told him motorcycle people are mean, Mark added. And several men laughed bitterly because they'd all heard variations of that their entire lives, from teachers, from cops, from neighbors who clutched their purses tighter when cuts walked past. But Eric couldn't see the leather or the patches or the tattoos. He just heard my voice helping him pick up apples, and he decided I didn't sound mean. Then he asked me the bravest question I've heard in years. What'd you tell him? Stitch asked. I told him I'd be there Monday, lunchtime. Roosevelt Elementary cafeteria. Mark crossed his arms, leather creaking. But here's the thing, brothers. I've been thinking about it all night, and one guy sitting with a kid who's been alone for 900 days isn't enough. It's a nice gesture, sure, but gestures fade. I want to make a statement. I want to show that kid, and every bully who's made him feel worthless, that when someone asks the Hells Angels for friendship, we don't send one person. We send an army. Kodiak finished, and the room erupted in agreement, men standing, voices overlapping, the energy shifting from curious to committed in the space of a heartbeat. Mark raised his hand for silence. This isn't about intimidation. We're not riding in there to scare kids or prove we're tough. We're riding in there to sit with Eric at lunch, to show him he matters, to prove that the scariest-looking men in Seattle are the only ones with the guts to do what's right. He looked around the room again. But I need to know who's in, because if we do this, we do it right. Full cuts, respectful, coordinated. This is about protecting a kid, not our reputation. Every hand in the room went up. Every single one. Mark felt his throat tighten because he'd known his brothers would come through. They always did, but seeing 55 men willing to take time off work, to risk judgment from a society that already thought the worst of them, just to make sure a blind 10-year-old didn't eat lunch alone, that was brotherhood in its purest form. Monday morning we ride, Mark said. 11 o'clock we meet here, full formation, and we show Seattle what the Hells Angels are really about. Sunday evening came with the kind of Seattle rain that wasn't quite heavy enough to soak you through, but persistent enough to remind you that November in the Pacific Northwest doesn't apologize for being gray and cold and relentless. Mark rode through Fremont, one of Seattle's quirky neighborhoods, known for its troll sculpture under the Aurora Bridge and vintage shops selling records and typewriters, until he found the address Sarah had texted him that afternoon. After apparently spending all day debating whether a Hells Angel making promises to her son at a farmer's market was genuine or dangerous, or some complicated mix of both. The house was small, a 1,950 seconds Rambler with peeling blue paint and a chain-link fence around a yard that needed mowing but probably wouldn't get it until spring when the rain finally stopped. Mark could see the glow of a television through the front window, could hear the faint sound of some animated movie playing, and he sat on his bike for a full minute, trying to figure out what he was going to say that wouldn't sound like he was some tough guy playing hero for a day before disappearing back into whatever life he'd come from. But he'd made a promise, and Wyatt Thompson kept his promises, so he killed the engine and walked up the cracked concrete path to knock on the door. Sarah answered, wearing the same wary expression she'd had at Pike Place. But behind her, Mark could see Eric sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, his white cane propped against the couch, his fingers running over what looked like a braille book, even though his attention was clearly on whoever was at the door. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said. Not quite a question, not quite a greeting. "Ma'am, I know it's late, but I wanted to stop by and make sure Eric knows I'm serious about tomorrow. Can I come in for a minute?" She hesitated, understandable, given that a man wearing a leather vest covered in patches that said things like Seattle and 1% was asking to enter her home, but then Eric's voice called out, "Is that Mark? Is that the motorcycle man?" And the hope in those 4 words made Sarah's decision for her. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside. Mark walked into a home that was clean but worn. Furniture that had been nice once upon a time, but now carried the weight of too many years and not enough money for upgrades. Walls decorated with crayon drawings that were clearly Eric's attempts at art, despite not being able to see what he was creating. Abstract swirls of color that somehow managed to be beautiful in their chaos. "Hey, Eric," Mark said, kneeling on the carpet near where the boy sat. "Remember me? You smell like motorcycles," Eric answered, which wasn't exactly a yes, but close enough. "And leather. And something else. Is that gasoline?" "Probably. I was working on my bike this afternoon, getting her ready for tomorrow." Mark glanced at Sarah, who was standing in the doorway to the kitchen with her arms crossed, watching this interaction like a referee ready to call a foul. "I wanted to come by and make sure you know I meant what I said. I'll be at your school tomorrow at lunch." Eric's face lit up in a way that made Mark's chest hurt. "Really? You're really coming?" "Really?" Mark paused, then decided honesty was better than mystery. "But I want to tell you something, and I need you to trust me that it's a good thing, even if it sounds scary at first." The boy's smile faltered slightly. "Okay. I told my friends about you," Mark said carefully. "About how you eat lunch alone, about how brave you were to ask me to sit with you. And they all decided that if you need one friend for lunch, we should give you more than one." He watched Eric's face, trying to gauge the reaction. "So tomorrow, It's not just going to be me. There's going to be about 55 of us. Sarah made a noise that might have been a gasp or a protest. But Eric's expression had transformed into something Mark couldn't quite read, confusion maybe, or disbelief. 55? 55 motorcycle people? 55 Hell's Angels? Mark corrected, because if they were doing this, they were doing it honestly. All coming to Roosevelt Elementary to sit with you at lunch. Is that okay? I know it's a lot, but why? Eric interrupted, his small hands gripping the Braille book so hard his knuckles went white. Why would 55 people come just for me? I'm just Eric. I'm just the weird blind kid nobody wants to eat with. And there it was, the core belief that had been hammered into this 10-year-old's head over 900 days of isolation, the lie that his disability made him less deserving of friendship, of attention, of mattering. Mark felt rage burning in his throat again, but he swallowed it down because Eric didn't need anger right now. He needed truth. You're not weird, Eric. You're brave. Do you know how much courage it takes to ask a stranger for help? Most adults can't do that. Most people would rather stay lonely than risk rejection. Mark shifted closer, his voice dropping to something gentler. My friends and I, we've all been through hard times. We've all felt alone, felt like nobody cared if we existed. And when I told them about you, about how you've been eating lunch by yourself for 5 years while everyone around you pretends you're invisible, they got angry. Not at you, at the situation. At a world that teaches kids to avoid anyone who's different, so we decided to show you something important. What? Eric whispered. That when you ask the Brotherhood for friendship, we don't do it halfway. We don't send one person to sit with you while everyone else forgets. We send everybody, because that's what family does. They show up, all of them, no matter what anyone thinks. Tears were streaming down Eric's face now, and Sarah had moved from the kitchen doorway to sit beside her son, her own eyes wet as she pulled him close. I don't understand, Eric said through the tears. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Mark thought about Danny, his younger brother, who'd been funny and smart and sensitive in ways the world didn't appreciate, who'd come back from Iraq quieter than he'd left, who'd spent 2 years isolated and depressed before finally deciding the loneliness was too heavy to carry anymore. He thought about finding Danny's body, about the note that said, I'm sorry I wasn't stronger, about the guilt Mark still carried, that he hadn't reached out more, hadn't shown up enough, hadn't made his brother believe that someone cared whether he existed. I had a brother, Mark said quietly. Danny. He died 15 years ago because he felt alone and didn't think anyone would notice if he disappeared. I was wrong. I didn't reach out enough, didn't make him believe he mattered. So when I meet a kid who's been alone for 900 days, who's brave enough to ask for help, I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. He looked at Sarah, then back to Eric. You deserve to be seen, Eric. Not pitied, not tolerated, seen. And tomorrow, 55 of us are going to make sure everyone at Roosevelt Elementary knows that. Eric was crying too hard to respond, but he reached out blindly until his hands found Mark's vest, and he held onto that leather like it was the only solid thing in a world that had been shifting under his feet for 5 years. Thank you, he finally managed. Thank you for not forgetting. I promised, Mark said simply, and Hell's Angels keep their promises. Sarah walked him to the door 15 minutes later, after Eric had calmed down enough to ask Mark to describe his motorcycle using sounds and textures instead of colors, and Mark had revved the engine gently in the driveway, while Eric stood on the porch with his hands covering his ears and the biggest smile Mark had seen yet. I don't know what to say, Sarah admitted, her voice shaking. I've been fighting this battle alone for so long, calling the school, talking to teachers, begging other parents to encourage their kids to include Eric. Nothing's worked. And you meet him once and you're bringing 55 people? Mom, your son is special. Not because he's blind, because he's brave enough to keep asking for what he needs even after being rejected for 5 years. Most people give up after the first few dozen times. Mark pulled on his gloves, preparing to ride home through the rain. Tomorrow's going to be intense. There will probably be news coverage, maybe some parents upset about bikers at an elementary school. But I called the principal this afternoon, explained the situation, and she agreed to let us in as long as we're respectful. You called Dr. Park? Sarah looked stunned. Had to. Can't just roll up to a school with 55 motorcycles without warning. That's how you get cops and lockdowns and traumatized kids. This is about helping Eric, not causing chaos. He swung his leg over his bike, the leather seat creaking under his weight. We'll be there at 11:45. Lunch starts at noon. And Sarah? Tomorrow, your son's going to learn what it feels like when people show up for you. Really show up. That's a lesson worth more than anything they teach in classrooms. He rode away into the Seattle rain, engine rumbling through quiet residential streets, and he thought about Eric's question, why would 55 people come just for me? And he realized that's exactly the question every lonely kid asks themselves when the world teaches them they're not worth showing up for. Tomorrow, they were going to answer that question in a way Roosevelt Elementary would never forget. Monday morning broke cold and gray over Seattle, the kind of November dawn that never quite gets bright, just transitions from black to charcoal to a pale wash of light that feels more like a suggestion than actual sunrise. Mark stood in the Hells Angels clubhouse parking lot at 6:30, coffee steaming in his hand, watching his breath fog in the air, while he mentally ran through everything that could go wrong with what they were about to do. The risks were real. They could scare kids instead of helping them, could give ammunition to every parent and politician who already thought motorcycle clubs were criminal enterprises disguised as social organizations, could turn Eric's moment into a circus that made his life worse instead of better. But Mark had been awake most of the night thinking about Danny's funeral, about standing in a cemetery, watching them lower his brother into the ground, while wondering if things would have been different if just one person had shown up when Danny needed them most. So yeah, there were risks, but doing nothing was a bigger risk, and Mark Thompson hadn't survived 2 tours in Iraq and 15 years as a Hells Angel by playing it safe. By 10:30, the parking lot was full 55 motorcycles lined up in formation like they were preparing for a military operation, which in a way they were. These men had shown up in full dress code, leather cuts polished and patches visible, American flags mounted on handlebars, chrome gleaming despite the overcast sky. Kodiak walked the line doing a final inspection, checking that everyone looked respectful rather than threatening, that no one was wearing anything that might scare elementary school kids. "Remember," Mark called out, his voice carrying across the lot, "we're not riding in there to intimidate, we're riding in there to protect. That means we're respectful to teachers, we're calm around students, we don't curse, we don't threaten, we don't make this about us. This is about Eric. This is about showing one lonely kid that he matters enough for 55 men to take time off work and ride across Seattle just to eat lunch with him." Wrench raised his hand. "What about the bullies? Kids been getting tormented for 5 years. We just supposed to ignore that?" "We handle it with presence, not violence," Mark answered. "Our job is to sit with Eric, to create a wall of protection around him that makes those bullies understand he's not alone anymore. If that makes them scared, makes them rethink their choices, good. But we're not threatening 11-year-olds. We're better than that." Stitch spoke up from the middle of the formation. "What about media? I saw 3 news vans outside Roosevelt Elementary when I drove past this morning. This is going to be covered." "Let it be covered," Mark said. "Let the whole country see that the Hells Angels rode across Seattle to sit with a blind kid at lunch. Let them see what Brotherhood really means." He checked his watch, 10:45. "We roll in 15 minutes. Silent ride, formation discipline. And when we get there, we park respectfully, and we walk in like we're visiting dignified guests, not invading enemy territory." The ride through Seattle was something Mark would remember for the rest of his life. 55 motorcycles moving through the city in perfect formation, engines rumbling low like distant thunder, citizens on sidewalks stopping to stare and point and pull out phones to record this strange parade of leather and chrome heading north toward Roosevelt Elementary. They took Aurora Avenue through downtown, past the Space Needle and Pike Place Market, where this had all started 2 days ago, through neighborhoods where people watering lawns or walking dogs froze to watch this procession pass. By 11:30, they'd reached the Fremont neighborhood, and Mark could see news helicopters circling overhead, could see the crowd gathering outside Roosevelt Elementary. Parents who'd heard rumors and shown up to either support or protest, depending on their perspective. The school's parking lot had been partially cleared by Seattle PD, who were standing by with the kind of tense body language that said they weren't sure if this was going to be a heartwarming human interest story or a situation requiring intervention. Mark pulled his bike to the front of the formation and killed the engine, and 54 others followed suit, the sudden silence almost louder than the rumble had been. He saw Dr. Janet Park standing near the school entrance, a black woman in her 50s wearing a professional suit, and the expression of someone who'd spent her entire weekend questioning whether she'd made the right decision, allowing this to happen. He walked over to her, removing his gloves respectfully. "Dr. Park, Mark Thompson. We spoke on the phone. Mr. Thompson." Her voice was tight, controlled. "I'll be honest, when you called yesterday, I thought you were either remarkably compassionate or completely insane. I'm still not sure which. Little of both, probably," Mark admitted. "But I want to be clear, we're here for Eric. We're not here to disrupt your school, scare your students, or cause problems. We're here to sit with a kid who's been eating lunch alone for 5 years while adults watched and did nothing." Dr. Park's expression shifted slightly, something like shame flickering across her face. "I've tried to address the bullying situation. We've had assemblies, we've talked to parents, we've implemented policies. I'm not here to judge your efforts, ma'am," Mark interrupted gently. "I'm here to supplement them. Sometimes kids need to see that adults will actually show up and do something dramatic enough to matter. Sometimes they need to learn that excluding someone has consequences, not punishment, but consequences. Like 55 bikers deciding that kid deserves better." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, slowly. "Lunch starts in 20 minutes. The cafeteria is through those doors, down the main hallway, 3rd door on the right. I'll have security escort you, but Mr. Thompson, if this goes sideways, if students are frightened or parents complain or this becomes a safety issue, then you throw us out and call the cops," Mark finished. "I get it, but it won't come to that. You have my word." At 11:45, 55 Hells Angels walked through the front doors of Roosevelt Elementary School, boots echoing on polished linoleum floors, covered in student artwork and motivational posters about kindness and inclusion messages that apparently hadn't made it to the cafeteria where Eric Matthews ate alone every single day. Teachers peeked out of classrooms, students pressed their faces against door windows, and Mark could hear whispered conversations trailing behind them like wake behind a boat. Are those real bikers? Why are they here? Is someone in trouble? Mark kept his eyes forward, kept his expression calm, because 55 men in leather cuts walking through an elementary school was already intimidating enough without adding aggressive body language to the mix. They reached the cafeteria at 11:47. Lunch had already started, and through the small window in the door, Mark could see exactly what Sarah and Eric had described. A room full of students sitting in clusters, laughing and talking and completely ignoring the small boy sitting alone near the windows with his white cane propped beside him and his lunch tray untouched. "Everyone ready?" Mark asked his brothers. 54 heads nodded. "Then let's show this school what the Hells Angels are really about." Mark pushed open the cafeteria doors, and 55 bikers walked in. Chapter 5. The cafeteria at Roosevelt Elementary School held roughly 200 students during the 4th grade lunch period, kids aged 9 to 11, sitting at long rectangular tables eating chicken nuggets and pizza and whatever soggy vegetables. The lunch, ladies insisted, counted as nutrition, Voices echoing off cinder-block walls painted that institutional beige color that every American public school seemed to think was calming, but really just felt like giving up. Eric Matthews sat at his usual table near the windows, third row from the front, right side, the table where he'd eaten alone for 917 consecutive school days, if you counted weekends and summers as interruptions, rather than merciful breaks from the routine humiliation of watching your peers choose. Anyone but you. He'd taken 2 bites of his sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, because that's what his mom could afford, and also what didn't require refrigeration, and he was listening to an audiobook through earbuds, turned up loud enough to drown out the laughter and conversation happening at every table, except his when the cafeteria doors opened with a sound that made every kid in the room stop mid-sentence. Boots. Heavy boots on linoleum. Not the sneakers or dress shoes teachers wore, but something heavier, something that sounded like authority and purpose and controlled power. Eric pulled out one earbud and tilted his head the way he always did when trying to understand the world through sound, and what he heard made his heart start hammering in his chest because he recognized that walk, that particular rhythm of leather and weight from 2 days ago at Pike Place Market. "Mark?" he whispered, but his voice was too quiet for anyone to hear over the sudden, complete silence that had fallen across the cafeteria like someone had hit a mute button on 200 conversations at once. Mark Wire Thompson walked through Roosevelt Elementary's cafeteria at 11:47 on a Monday morning in November, with 54 Hells Angels behind him, and the sight was something out of a movie that hadn't been made yet. Men in leather cuts covered in patches that said Seattle and 1% and Friend Forever, Forever Friend. Men with beards and tattoos and scars from wars, fought in countries most of these kids couldn't find on a map. Men who looked exactly like what society had taught these students to fear, but who were walking through this school with their heads high and their intentions pure. Teachers along the walls froze, hands moving instinctively toward the panic buttons they'd been told to press if dangerous individuals ever entered the building. Students at the front tables pushed back in their chairs, eyes wide with confusion and fear and fascination, because this wasn't a drill, and it wasn't something from their active shooter training. This was real men who looked dangerous walking into their safe space without warning or explanation. And then Mark spoke, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with the kind of projection that comes from years of shouting orders over motorcycle engines and gunfire. "We're looking for Eric Matthews." Every head in the room swiveled toward the small boy sitting alone by the windows, and Eric's hands were shaking so hard he dropped his sandwich onto his tray, peanut butter smearing across cheap plastic. "Mark?" he called out, louder this time, his voice cracking with emotion he couldn't control. "Is that you?" "Yeah, buddy," Mark answered, and he was already walking toward Eric's table, his brothers fanning out behind him in a formation that was both protective and respectful, creating space rather than crowding it. "Sorry, we're late. Mind if we join you for lunch?" The walk across that cafeteria took maybe 15 seconds, but felt like eternity. Every student watching, every teacher trying to decide if they should intervene or document, every security guard speaking urgently into radios, while Dr. Park's voice crackled back, telling them to stand down, that this was planned, that everything was under control, even though nothing about this felt controlled to anyone who was watching. Mark reached Eric's table and knelt beside the boy, bringing himself down to eye level, even though Eric couldn't see the gesture, because some things are about respect more than visibility. And Mark Thompson had learned long ago that how you treat the vulnerable says everything about who you really are. "Hey, Eric, remember what I told you last night? About bringing some friends?" Eric's hands reached out, trembling, until they found Mark's leather vest, and his fingers traced the patches like he was reading Braille, like he was trying to confirm through touch that this was real and not some dream or cruel joke. "You came," he whispered, and tears were already streaming down his face, soaking into the collar of his yellow t-shirt. "You really came." "He promised," Mark said simply. And Hell's Angels keep their promises. He stood up and addressed the room again, his voice firm but not threatening, authoritative but not aggressive. My name is Mark Thompson. I'm the president of the Hell's Angels Seattle chapter. 2 days ago, I met Eric at Pike Place Market, and he told me something that broke my heart. He's been eating lunch alone at this school for 5 years, every single day. So he asked me if I could sit with him today, and I said yes. But I decided that one person wasn't enough. He gestured to the 54 men spreading throughout the cafeteria. So we brought 55. Kodiak moved to the table directly behind Eric's and sat down with a grace surprising for a man his size, his massive frame somehow non-threatening as he carefully placed his leather gloves on the table and folded his hands like he was about to pray. Wrench and Stitch took positions at the tables to Eric's left and right. More bikers filled in the surrounding area, creating a wall of protection that made it physically impossible for anyone to approach Eric's table without going through them first. And then, slowly, deliberately, every single Hell's Angel opened lunch bags or pulled out sandwiches from inside their cuts, and they began to eat casually, calmly, like sitting in an elementary school cafeteria surrounded by stunned children and terrified teachers was the most normal thing in the world. Dylan Kruger, 11 years old, 6th grader, chief architect of Eric's isolation for the past 3 years, sat frozen at a table near the back of the cafeteria, his chicken nuggets forgotten, his face pale as he processed what he was witnessing. He'd called Eric Bat Boy just that morning in the hallway. He'd knocked Eric's cane out of his hand before first period. He'd convinced his friends that anyone who sat with Eric would become a target too, had built an entire social structure around excluding this one blind kid. And now 55 Hell's Angels were sitting with Eric like he was the most important person in the building. "I don't understand," whispered a girl at Dylan's table. Emma Chen, 9 years old, someone who'd wanted to be Eric's friend in 2nd grade, but had been too scared of social consequences to follow through. "Why are they here?" "Because nobody else was," Dylan answered quietly, and something in his voice sounded like understanding just beginning to break through years of cruelty learned from parents who'd taught him that different meant less than. Mark pulled out a sandwich from his cut turkey and Swiss on wheat bread that his girlfriend had made that morning when he'd explained what he was doing, and he sat down directly across from Eric, close enough that the boy could hear him clearly. "How you doing, buddy?" "I can't believe you're here," Eric said, his voice still shaking. "I can't believe all of you are here. Why would you do this? Why would 55 people come just for me?" "Because you asked," Mark answered simply. "Because you were brave enough to ask for help, and because we're tired of watching kids suffer while adults pretend not to notice." He unwrapped his sandwich, the crinkling plastic loud in the unnaturally quiet cafeteria. "You know what I learned in the army, Eric? That showing up matters more than anything else. You can have all the good intentions in the world, but if you don't actually show up when someone needs you, those intentions don't mean anything. So when a 10-year-old kid who's been alone for 5 years asks if someone can sit with him at lunch, we show up, all of us." Around them, the cafeteria was slowly coming back to life, students starting to whisper to each other, teachers relaxing slightly as they realized this wasn't a threat, but something else entirely, something they didn't have protocols for, because nobody had ever written a handbook for what to do when bikers show up to end bullying through radical inclusion. A teacher approached cautiously. Mrs. Patterson, Eric's 4th grade teacher, the same one who'd told her class that motorcycle gang members are dangerous criminals just last week during a lesson about community safety. She looked at Mark with a mixture of fear and confusion and something that might have been shame. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Park asked me to check if you need anything." "Just lunch," Mark answered politely. "And maybe a message to whoever's been ignoring the fact that this kid eats alone every day." His tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the voice of someone pointing out a failure without excusing it. Mrs. Patterson's face reddened. "We've tried to encourage students to include Eric. Tried isn't the same as succeeded. Kodiak said from behind them, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. And encouraging isn't the same as requiring. You got anti-bullying policies? Great, enforce them, because right now, 55 bikers are doing your job. The teacher backed away, and Mark could see her eyes were wet, could see that she was processing something uncomfortable about her own complicity in Eric's isolation. Good. Sometimes shame was the first step toward change. Eric was eating his sandwich now, taking small bites while tears continued streaming down his face. And Mark realized the kid wasn't crying from sadness anymore, he was crying from relief, from the overwhelming emotion of being seen after 5 years of invisibility, from finally understanding that asking for help wasn't weakness but courage. "Mark," Eric said quietly. "Yeah, buddy? Thank you. Thank you for not forgetting me." Mark's throat tightened, and he thought about Danny again, about all the times his brother had probably needed someone to show up, and Mark hadn't understood the signs, hadn't known how to help until it was too late. "You're not someone people should forget, Eric. You're brave and kind and you matter. Don't let anyone ever convince you otherwise." And sitting there in Roosevelt Elementary's cafeteria, surrounded by 54 brothers who'd dropped everything to make sure a blind 10-year-old didn't eat lunch alone, Mark realized that maybe they hadn't just saved Eric today, maybe Eric had saved them too, had reminded them why they wore these cuts in the first place, had given them a purpose beyond reputation and rebellion. The lunch period lasted another 35 minutes, and by the time it ended, something fundamental had shifted in that cafeteria, in that school, in the way 200 students understood courage and kindness and what it really meant when adults promised to protect the vulnerable.